Did you know that an entire empire, one that stretched from the misty shores of Britain to the sun-scorched sands of Mesopotamia, can get sick? Not like a person with a cough or a cold, but a deep, systemic illness, a fever in its very soul. Imagine standing in the center of the world, surrounded by gleaming marble and the roar of a million voices, and feeling a faint, almost imperceptible tremor under your feet. It's not an earthquake, it's the first symptom of a body turning against itself. Before you get too comfortable, go ahead and like this video and subscribe to the channel to encourage me to make more content like this. Also, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights, and let's begin tonight's journey. You are walking through the Roman Forum, the very heart of this colossus. The sun is warm on your face, reflecting off the white stone of the temples of Saturn and Vesta. You see senators in their pristine white togas, embroidered with a bold purple stripe, debating matters of state with dramatic gestures. Merchants from every known corner of the world shout their wares in a dozen different languages. The air thick with the scent of exotic spices, baking bread, and the sweat of a city that never stops moving. This is the Rome everyone imagines, the one carved into history as eternal, invincible. The sheer scale of it all feels permanent, as though the gods themselves laid these foundations. To your left, the Colosseum looms, a monument to a power so vast it can command death for entertainment. It is a symbol of absolute strength. But you look closer, you see the cracks, not in the marble, but in the people. You see a legionary, home from a campaign in Germania, with a haunted look in his eyes that no victory parade can erase. You pass a darkened alleyway, and the sweet smell of spices is momentarily replaced by the sharp, biting stench of ammonia from a fuller's workshop, where clothes are bleached using aged urine collected in public pots. It's a strange, earthy reality that exists just beneath the veneer of imperial grandeur. This city, for all its glory, is also a place of profound struggle. Historians still debate the exact moment the illness took hold, whether it was a single event or a slow, creeping decay that began centuries before the final collapse. But they increasingly agree on one thing: the fatal wound was not inflicted by a barbarian sword, it was self-inflicted. You feel that tremor again, stronger this time. It's the vibration of a system under immense strain. The city is a giant, but its bones are growing brittle. Its arteries, the aqueducts and roads, are still functioning. But the water they carry and the goods they transport are starting to serve a population that is slowly forgetting what it means to be Roman. The Colossus has a fever. It's a low-grade burn for now. A slight warmth you might dismiss as just another hot day, but it's there, in the bitter cynicism of a politician, in the desperation of a farmer forced off his land, in the very air you breathe. The story of Rome's fall is not about an external enemy at the gates. It's about the enemy that was already inside, barricading the doors and setting the fire itself. You wander away from the political heart of the Forum, drawn by the chaotic symphony of commerce. You find yourself in a crowded marketplace, a labyrinth of stalls and shouting vendors. The air is a tapestry of smells, from roasting chestnuts to the pungent odor of garum, the infamous fermented fish sauce that Romans put on almost everything. It's the engine room of the city, where the wealth of an empire is exchanged hand over hand. You approach a money changer's stall, a small, cluttered booth tucked between a baker and a silk merchant. The man behind the counter has shrewd, tired eyes, and his hands move with the practiced ease of someone who has weighed and tested 1,000,000 coins. He is a doctor of the empire's financial health, and his diagnosis is grim. He sees you looking, and with a slight nod, he slides 2 coins across the worn wooden counter. At a glance, they look similar. Both are denarii, the famous silver coin that serves as the backbone of Roman commerce. Both bear the profile of a stern-faced emperor, but you reach out and pick them up, and the illusion shatters. The first coin is heavy, dense, and cool in your palm. It feels like real wealth. You can almost feel the authority of Emperor Augustus radiating from it, a solid promise of value. This is nearly pure silver, a coin that could be trusted from Britannia to Judea. It is the bedrock of a stable economy. Then you pick up the second coin. It's shockingly light. The silver wash is thin, a costume barely concealing the dull, reddish copper beneath. A small scratch on the emperor's cheek reveals the cheap metal core. This coin is from a later era, a ghost of its former self. This is the currency of lies. This is where the suicide begins, not with a bang, but with a quiet, insidious deception. The state needed more money. The armies were vast and demanding pay. The bureaucracy was bloated, and the people in the city expected their free grain. So, the emperors found a simple, terrible solution. They melted down the old pure coins, mixed the silver with cheap metals like copper and tin, and minted more coins from the debased alloy. It was the ancient world's version of printing money, and it was a catastrophic self-inflicted wound. You can imagine the slow, dawning horror for the average Roman. One day, a denarius buys a loaf of bread, a measure of wine, and some cheese. A few years later, that same coin barely buys the bread. Your life savings, tucked away in a clay pot, are turning into worthless metal discs. It's a betrayal. The very symbol of the empire's power and stability, the money it issues, is now a fraud. Historians still debate whether the relentless debasement was a sign of panicked incompetence or a cynical, calculated policy to fund a failing state. Some Romans were savvy. They would refuse to accept the newer, lighter coins, or would only trade them for a fraction of their face value. People started hoarding the older, purer coins, pulling them out of circulation and making the problem even worse. It was a vote of no confidence in the future of Rome, cast in silver and copper. As you stand there, holding the 2 denarii, you understand. Rome wasn't just spending itself to death, it was destroying the very concept of value, poisoning the trust that held its vast, complex society together. You leave the money changer and his 2 coins, the tangible proof of a broken promise, and your gaze is drawn upwards, towards the Palatine Hill. The opulent palaces of the emperors loom over the forum, a constant, silent reminder of where the real power now resides. But you turn your attention to a more modest, yet historically profound building, the Curia Julia, the Senate House of Rome. From the outside, it looks solid, imposing. This was once the chamber where Cicero railed against conspiracies and where Cato defended the ancient virtues of the Republic. It feels like sacred ground. You slip inside, finding a spot in the shadows to observe. The scene before you is a perfect tableau of power, but it's a hollow performance. Men in expensive togas sit on tiered benches, their faces a mixture of boredom, veiled ambition, and quiet fear. A senator is speaking, his voice echoing slightly in the vast, marbled hall. His words are florid, full of praise for the emperor's wisdom, his generosity, his divine foresight. He is proposing a new honor for the emperor, perhaps another statue, or naming a month after one of his family members. It sounds important, but you notice no one is really listening. They are waiting for the inevitable, unanimous vote. This isn't a debate. It's a ceremony of submission. The Roman Republic, the great experiment in self-governance, is dead. It just hasn't stopped twitching yet. This is the political suicide of Rome, a slow poisoning of its founding ideals. The state still calls itself the Senate and people of Rome, a famous phrase you've seen carved on monuments, but it has become a lie. The people have their bread and circuses, and the Senate has its ceremony and titles. Real power now flows from a single source, the emperor. He is the one who commands the legions, controls the treasury, and whose word is law. The senators know it, the emperor knows it, and the people in the streets, trading their debased coins, know it too. The vibrant, chaotic, and often violent participation of the Republican era has been replaced by a quiet, orderly, and soul-crushing apathy. You can almost picture the early days of this transition under Augustus, the master politician who maintained the illusion of the Republic while single-handedly dismantling it. He called himself princeps, or first citizen, a humble title for a man who held absolute power. It was a brilliant, gentle strangulation. Historians still debate whether the Roman people truly mourned the loss of the Republic, or if they willingly traded liberty for the stability and prosperity of the early empire. After a century of bloody civil wars, perhaps the promise of peace was worth any price. An interesting detail is that the government published a sort of daily gazette called the Acta Diurna, carved on stone or metal and posted in public places. It listed official business, including Senate decrees, giving the populace a sense of continued participation. But it was pure political theater, designed to make autocracy feel like a partnership. Why die for a state that is no longer yours? When your only role is to applaud, you lose the muscle required to fight. Rome was slowly severing the bond between the citizen and the state, a bond that had been its greatest strength. It was another deliberate step towards its own end. You step out of the quiet tomb of the Senate House and back into the living, breathing city, but your focus has shifted. You no longer see the merchants or the monuments. Instead, your eyes are drawn to the soldiers, not the weary legionaries with their dusty, functional armor, but a different breed. They stand guard outside important buildings, their armor gleaming, intricately sculpted with lightning bolts and eagles. They wear magnificent crested helmets with plumes of horsehair dyed a royal purple. These are the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's personal bodyguards. Their job is to be the final, impenetrable wall between the ruler of the world and his enemies. The irony, a truly fatal irony, is that they would become his most dangerous and prolific assassins. This is the poisoned chalice of power, a drink every emperor, after the first few, was forced to accept. You watch a pair of them moving through the crowd, and people part for them instinctively, a gesture born of both respect and fear. Their loyalty wasn't to the idea of Rome, or to the Senate, or to the people. It was to the man who paid them the most. And if he stopped paying, or if someone else offered more, that loyalty could evaporate in the space of a single sword thrust. This created a terrifying and predictable cycle. An emperor would be murdered by the very men sworn to protect him. The guard would then proclaim a new emperor, often the one who had conspired with them, or, at the very least, was willing to pay a massive bonus, known as a donative, upon his accession. This new emperor would then live his entire reign in the shadow of that same guard, knowing that his life depended on keeping them happy and rich. It was a protection racket at the very heart of the empire. Historians still debate whether the Praetorian Guard was a fundamental design flaw in the imperial system from its inception, or a necessary evil that only became corrupted over time. But the consequences are undeniable. The position of emperor, the most powerful office in the world, became dangerously unstable. It was no longer about lineage or ability, but about who could command the loyalty of a few thousand elite soldiers garrisoned right there in the city. The entire state was a hostage. This corrosive dynamic reached its most absurd and shameful climax in the year 193 AD, a moment that perfectly captures this element of Rome's suicide. After murdering the Emperor Pertinax, the Praetorian Guard did something unprecedented. They barricaded themselves in their fortified camp and announced they would sell the Roman Empire to the highest bidder. It was literally an auction. Two wealthy senators, one of them the ill-fated Didius Julianus, rushed to the walls of the camp and began shouting out bids like they were haggling for a used chariot. Didius Julianus won, promising a staggering sum to each soldier. He bought the throne, but he couldn't hold it. An empire purchased by cash has no legitimacy, and he was overthrown and executed just a few months later. Imagine the message this sent to the rest of the world. The throne of Augustus and Marcus Aurelius was now a commodity for sale. This wasn't a barbarian invasion. This was Rome's own Praetorian Guard, its elite protectors, putting a price tag on its soul. You move on, leaving the high-stakes drama of the imperial palace behind, and are pulled toward an entirely different kind of energy. It's a low, constant roar in the distance, the sound of 100,000 people shouting as one. It leads you, inevitably, to the gargantuan form of the Colosseum. You step inside, and the scale of the place is breathtaking. It's a universe unto itself. The sun beats down on the upper tiers, while a complex system of awnings, the velarium, manipulated by skilled sailors, provides shade for the wealthier spectators below. The air is thick with the smell of dust, sweat, and cheap wine. This is the circus's part of the infamous equation. You look down at the arena floor. Today, it's a reenactment of a famous battle. Men dressed as Carthaginians and Romans clash in a chaotic but carefully choreographed spectacle. The crowd loves it. They cheer, they boo, they gamble on the outcome. It is the most magnificent and expensive distraction ever conceived. But as you watch, you realize this isn't just entertainment. It's a form of mass tranquilizer. The roiling, potentially rebellious population of Rome, packed into crowded and often unsanitary apartment blocks, is being pacified with spectacle. It's a state-sponsored television, and the programming is running 24/7. It's hard to get worked up about inflation or corrupt senators when you're watching a staged naval battle. And yes, they did that. As an absurdly expensive display of power, they would sometimes flood the entire Colosseum floor to enact famous sea victories with real, albeit smaller, ships. Later, you see the other half of the bargain. You watch as long, orderly lines of citizens queue up at designated distribution points. They hold clay tokens, which they exchange for their allotment of grain. This is the cura annone, the grain dole. This is the bread. It was a massive state-funded welfare program that, at its peak, fed hundreds of thousands of Roman citizens for free. It began as a way to prevent famine and riots, a sensible policy for a city that had outgrown its local food supply. But over the centuries, it morphed into something else entirely. It became an entitlement, a birthright. This is the bread and circuses trap. It's a simple, devastatingly effective contract. The state provides free food and spectacular entertainment. In return, the people give up their political voice and their civic responsibility. Why should a man worry about the future of the Republic when his belly is full and his mind is occupied by gladiators? The policy eroded the famous Roman work ethic. For a huge segment of the population, there was little incentive to seek productive employment. The state provided the basics. This created a vast class of people who were dependent, passive, and politically inert. Historians still debate whether this policy was a brilliant feat of social engineering that kept the peace for centuries, or a terminal illness that sapped the vitality of the Roman people, making them soft and complacent. But from your vantage point, it looks like a clear act of self-harm. Rome was systematically dismantling the ambition and self-reliance of its own citizens. It was a comfortable, entertaining, and ultimately fatal arrangement. Another part of the slow, methodical process of taking its own life. You turn your back on the Colosseum's roar and begin to walk, seeking higher ground. The city streets are a dense network of canyons, but you find a winding path that takes you up one of Rome's 7 hills. As you ascend, the noise of the city softens into a distant hum, and the air grows cleaner. You reach the summit, perhaps a quiet garden behind a wealthy patrician's villa, and you look out. The view is staggering. Below you, Rome is a sea of terracotta roofs, punctuated by the gleaming marble of temples and public buildings. But your gaze travels further, beyond the city walls. You see the great aqueducts, marching across the plains on their stone arches, the lifeblood of the city. You see the famous roads, like the Appian Way, arrow straight, stretching out towards the horizon, disappearing into the hazy distance. From this vantage point, you can finally grasp the true scale of the problem. You are not just in a city, you are in the nerve center of a global power. The empire at its peak, under the Emperor Trajan, stretched from the rain-swept frontiers of Scotland to the scorching deserts of modern Iraq. It wrapped itself around the entire Mediterranean Sea, which the Romans called Mare Nostrum, our sea. It felt permanent, boundless, but you realize it was a profoundly unhealthy state. It was an empire that had become addicted to conquest. For centuries, expansion had fueled the Roman machine. New territories brought new sources of tax revenue, gold from mines, and, most importantly, millions of slaves to work the fields and build the monuments. But addictions are unsustainable. Eventually, the addict needs more and more of the substance just to feel normal. Rome needed more wars simply to pay for the last one. This is the great paradox of Rome's size, the concept of overextension. It looked like strength, but it was a fatal weakness. The empire became too large to manage, too vast to defend. A message from a general on the Rhine frontier could take 2 months to reach the emperor in Rome, and his reply would take another 2 months to get back. A crisis could be over, for better or worse, before the leadership even knew it had begun. The frontiers were thousands of miles long, a porous border impossible to seal. Putting out a fire in one province meant pulling legions from another, leaving it vulnerable. It was a giant, lumbering beast that could no longer feel its own extremities. Historians still debate whether the decision to stop expanding after Trajan was a sign of strategic genius or the first open admission that the empire had reached its breaking point. To manage this sprawling territory, the Romans developed a remarkable state postal and transport system called the cursus publicus. Official couriers with a special diploma could travel at incredible speeds, demanding fresh horses, food, and lodging from every town along their route. It was the world's first express mail service, a logistical marvel, but it was also a crushing burden on the provincials, who were legally required to provide for these couriers at their own expense. An early example of the state devouring its own people to sustain itself. You look out at those roads, stretching to the ends of the earth, and you see them not as arteries of a healthy body, but as the strained synapses of a brain that can no longer control its own limbs. This was not a murder by 1,000 cuts from barbarian hordes. It was death by gigantism, a slow, systemic failure brought on by its own insatiable appetite. Your gaze pulls back from the distant horizon, from the overwhelming scale of the empire, and focuses once more on the men meant to defend it. You see a legionary patrol marching along a dusty road below, but they look different from the soldiers you imagined, the ones from the glorious era of Caesar or Augustus. The classic image of a Roman soldier is one of uniformity and discipline, encased in the iconic lorica segmentata, that articulated armor of overlapping metal plates. They carried the heavy, curved rectangular shield, the scutum, and moved as one unstoppable unit. They were Italian farmer citizens, men who owned a piece of Rome and were willing to die for it. But that army is long gone. The soldiers you see now are a motley crew. Their armor is a mix of styles. Some wear chainmail, others simple leather cuirasses. Their shields are round or oval, not the interlocking rectangles of the past. They carry long spears and axes, and their faces, their hair, their language are not Roman. They are Goths, Franks, Vandals. These are the Hollow Legions. This is the military manifestation of Rome's suicide. The very institution designed to protect the state was being systematically filled with men who had no reason to love it. The recruitment pool of loyal Roman citizens had dried up. Why would a man who gets free bread and entertainment risk his life on a cold, miserable frontier? Why would a tenant farmer, working land he could never own, fight for the wealthy aristocrats who had driven him into poverty? So, Rome did what any desperate, wealthy empire does. It hired mercenaries, but it went a step further. It began recruiting entire barbarian tribes, settling them on Roman land inside the frontiers, and designating them as foederati, or allies. In exchange for land and a hefty payment in gold, these tribes were tasked with defending their patch of the border against other, more hostile tribes. It seemed like a clever solution on paper, but in practice, it was an abdication of the most fundamental duty of a state, its own defense. These warriors fought under their own chieftains, used their own battle tactics, and spoke their own languages. Their loyalty was to their commander and their people, not to a distant emperor or an abstract concept of Rome. This policy backfired in the most spectacular and tragic way at the Battle of Adrianople in 378 AD. The Goths, who had been allowed into the empire as foederati, felt mistreated and rose in a massive rebellion. The Eastern Roman Emperor Valens led his army against them, confident in a traditional Roman victory. Instead, the Roman legions were annihilated, and the emperor himself was killed. It was a shock from which the empire never truly recovered. It proved that the hired help was now more powerful than the master. Historians still debate whether this barbarization of the army was a pragmatic adaptation to a manpower crisis or the single greatest strategic blunder in Roman history. A curious detail reflecting this decline is the simplification of the soldiers' equipment. The iconic pilum, the heavy-throwing javelin designed to bend on impact to prevent it from being thrown back, was largely replaced by simpler spears. The complex armor was gone. It was cheaper, faster, and easier to equip non-Roman troops with gear they were already familiar with. You watch the patrol disappear down the road, and you understand the terrifying truth. The men guarding the gates were now indistinguishable from the men trying to break them down. Rome was paying its own invaders to live inside its walls. You are back in the city now, navigating the labyrinthine streets of the Suburra, a dense, lower-class neighborhood teeming with life, noise, and constant movement. The sheer population of Rome, estimated at perhaps 1 million people at its height, was a feat of urban planning and logistics that stunned the ancient world. But as you walk, you notice a subtle, yet chilling absence. The city seems quieter than it should be. The crowds in the streets are thinner. The bustling energy is diminished. This is the empire grappling with the silent plagues, a demographic self-destruction that decimated its population and psychological health. The famous plagues of the Roman world were devastating, far more lethal than the occasional barbarian raid. The most infamous was the Antonine Plague, which struck around 165 AD. It swept through the empire, carried by soldiers returning from a campaign in the east, and is believed to have been an outbreak of smallpox. The death toll was staggering, with estimates suggesting it killed 1/4 to 1/3 of the population in some regions. Think about that. You wake up one day, and 1/3 of your neighbors, friends, and family are simply gone. The grief is unimaginable. The immediate impact on the military was profound, weakening the legions at a time when the frontiers were under increasing pressure. But the long-term effects were far more damaging. It wasn't just the sheer number of deaths. It was the psychological trauma, the disruption of social life, and the crippling loss of productivity. Agriculture, the backbone of the economy, suffered immensely as farmers died or fled their land. Trade routes, already strained by corruption and inflation, became unreliable as merchants feared contagion. The plague struck the cities hardest, but its ripple effects reached every corner of the empire. This loss of manpower was a deep wound that Rome never truly healed. It permanently altered the social and economic landscape. Historians still debate whether the Roman penchant for dense, urban living, with its lack of sanitation and crowded conditions, made them more susceptible to these devastating outbreaks. A fascinating and macabre detail is the disease of the emperors, an obscure illness, perhaps a form of epilepsy or chronic lead poisoning, that seemed to afflict the imperial family disproportionately, creating instability at the very top. But the broader demographic collapse from plagues, combined with a persistent drop in birth rates, created an irreversible demographic crisis. You look around at the city. The aqueducts are still flowing. The public baths are still open. But the people who once filled the seats of the Colosseum and worked in the fields are fewer and farther between. This is a subtle but profound form of suicide. An empire can recover from a war, from political intrigue, or even from economic depression, but it cannot recover from a failure to reproduce itself. The legions were hollow, as you saw earlier, but the citizenry was also shrinking. It was a population hemorrhaging, a slow and silent process, yet another way in which Rome was killing itself from the inside out. As you wander through the quieter, emptier streets, you notice a change in the spiritual landscape of the city. The great, state-sponsored temples to Jupiter, Juno, and Mars still stand, magnificent and imposing, but they feel like museums. The official rituals are still performed by priests in their ceremonial robes, but the fervor is gone. There's a hollowness to the spectacle, a sense that people are just going through the motions. The pragmatic, transactional religion of the Roman state, where you sacrifice to the gods in exchange for their favor, no longer seems to be enough. It doesn't answer the deeper questions that haunt a society in decline. You see small groups of people slipping into less conspicuous buildings. In one, you hear the clashing of cymbals and the sound of ecstatic chanting. This is a temple dedicated to Cybele, the great mother goddess from Anatolia, whose priests were known for their frenzied, self-mutilating rituals. In another, you see men gathering in a dark, underground chamber, they are initiates in the cult of Mithras, a Persian deity popular with soldiers, who promised salvation and a clear moral code in a chaotic world. These are the mystery cults, and their popularity is exploding. They offer what the old gods do not, a personal relationship with the divine, a sense of belonging to a select group, and the promise of life after death. This is Rome experiencing a profound crisis of faith. The spiritual immune system of the empire is breaking down. The old certainties are gone, and people are desperately searching for new ones. And then, you encounter the most successful and disruptive of these new faiths. You see a small, humble gathering in the atrium of a private home. There are no idols, no grand temples, no bloody sacrifices. People are sharing a simple meal of bread and wine, listening to a man read from a scroll. They speak of love, of forgiveness, of a single, all-powerful God who cares for the poor and the downtrodden. This is Christianity. In the early days, it was just one of many strange Eastern cults, but it had unique strengths. It was open to everyone, men and women, rich and poor, slave and free. Its message of hope and eternal life was incredibly appealing in a world filled with plagues, wars, and uncertainty. The rise of Christianity was, from the traditional Roman perspective, a form of cultural suicide. The old Roman religion was inextricably linked to the state. To sacrifice to the gods was to demonstrate your loyalty to the empire. The Christians, with their refusal to worship the emperor as a god, were seen as atheists and traitors. Their stubborn monotheism was a direct challenge to the entire social and political order. Historians still debate whether Christianity was a cause of Rome's fall or merely a symptom of its decay, a new system that simply moved in to fill the spiritual vacuum left by the old one. One of the most common, and frankly amusing, Roman accusations against the Christians was that they were cannibal, a misunderstanding of the Eucharist ritual, where they spoke of consuming the body and blood of Christ. You see the quiet conviction on the faces of the people in that small house church, and you understand, this isn't just a new religion, it's a new identity. As the idea of being Roman became weaker and less meaningful, the idea of being Christian became stronger and more compelling. The empire was losing the battle for the hearts and minds of its own people. You leave the spiritual turmoil behind and head down towards the river Tiber, to the bustling port of Ostia Antica, the commercial gateway to Rome. For centuries, this was the Wall Street of the ancient world, a dizzying hub of global trade. Huge grain ships from Egypt and North Africa would dock here, their precious cargo transferred to smaller river barges for the final journey up to the city. You can almost feel the phantom energy of the place. You imagine warehouses stuffed with silk from China, spices from India, amber from the Baltic, and wine from Gaul. The Roman economy was a miracle of complexity and integration, a single market that stretched across 3 continents, all connected by the sea lanes of Mare Nostrum and that incredible network of roads. But the scene you witness now is one of quiet decay. Many of the great warehouses are empty, their doors sealed, their tiled roofs starting to crumble. The shipping offices, the stations, which once represented dozens of trading cities from around the empire, are shuttered. The docks are eerily quiet. Only a handful of ships are being unloaded, and their cargo is mostly military supplies, not the luxury goods of a confident, prosperous era. The complex, interconnected economy that was one of Rome's greatest achievements has seized up and collapsed. It's another critical organ failure in the empire's slow suicide. The reasons for this collapse are the very same self-inflicted wounds you've already seen. The rampant inflation you witnessed in the marketplace made long-term contracts and investments impossible. How can you agree on a price for a shipment of olive oil that will take 6 months to arrive when the value of your money is evaporating daily? The endless civil wars made the sea lanes and roads unsafe. Piracy, once eradicated by Pompey the Great, was rampant again, and the crippling taxes levied to pay for the bloated army and bureaucracy squeezed merchants and producers until there was no profit left to be made. Why risk a dangerous sea voyage just to have the government confiscate most of your earnings? The result was a slow, agonizing return to a more primitive economic state. Trade ground to a halt. Regions that had once specialized in producing one thing, like Egyptian grain or Spanish olive oil, were now forced to become self-sufficient. Because they could no longer rely on imports, the great integrated market fractured into 1,000 tiny, isolated local economies. Barter began to replace coinage in many transactions. A farmer might trade a sack of wheat for a new pair of sandals, completely bypassing the devalued currency. Historians still debate the precise timeline of this economic disintegration, but its effects were catastrophic. The vibrant, urbanized world of the Roman Empire began to ruralize and simplify. Cities shrank because they could no longer be supplied. The intricate division of labor that had created so much wealth simply vanished. A famous and often misinterpreted piece of evidence for this is the discovery of coin hoards. People often assume buried treasure means prosperity, but in reality, burying your money is an act of extreme economic pessimism. It means you have zero faith in banks, in investments, or in the future. You are simply hiding what little you have, hoping to survive the collapse. You look at the silent docks of Ostia, and you realize you are witnessing the death of a globalized world, a world that would not re-emerge for another 1,000 years. The quiet decay of the port feels like a symptom of a deeper, more violent sickness. You turn your gaze inward, back toward the political landscape, and the story shifts from a slow, chronic illness to a series of acute, bloody seizures. You are now witnessing the crisis of the 3rd century, a harrowing 50-year period where the Roman Empire was not just in decline, but in a state of constant, convulsive civil war. It was the empire's addiction to internal conflict, a horrifying spectacle of Rome tearing itself to pieces with its own hands. The cycle became numbingly predictable. A successful general on the frontier, having won a victory against some external tribe, would be hailed as emperor by his own legions. His soldiers, loyal to him and the promise of a massive bonus, would march on Rome, or wherever the current emperor was. The state would then be plunged into another devastating civil war. Roman legions, the most sophisticated fighting force in the ancient world, were no longer primarily guarding the borders. They were fighting and killing each other. The very purpose of the army was perverted. It became a king-making machine, and the fuel it ran on was Roman blood. During this 50-year span, from roughly 235 to 284 AD, there were at least 26 claimants to the throne, and those are just the legitimate ones recognized by the Senate. Countless other usurpers rose and fell in the provinces. To be emperor during this time was practically a death sentence. Almost all of them died violently, often murdered by their own troops who had already picked a new favorite. Imagine the sheer chaos and instability. The empire was like a patient suffering from a violent autoimmune disease, where the body's own defense systems attack and destroy healthy tissue. Legion fought legion over the right to choose the next man who would, in all likelihood, be murdered in a year or two. Historians still debate the root cause of this crisis. Was it the logical conclusion of the Praetorian Guard's king-making, now expanded to every army on the frontier? Was it the economic collapse you witnessed earlier, which made soldiers desperate and willing to gamble on a new leader? Or was it the sheer ambition of powerful men in a system that had no clear, peaceful mechanism for succession? A darkly comic detail from this period is the story of the so-called Gallic Empire and Palmyrene Empire. For a time, the Roman Empire literally split into three warring pieces, with the usurper in Gaul ruling the western provinces and the formidable Queen Zenobia ruling a breakaway empire from Palmyra in the east, while the legitimate emperor in Rome controlled Italy and Africa. It was the ultimate physical expression of the empire's internal divisions. You can feel the exhaustion of the people. How can you plant your crops, run your business, or raise your family when you don't know who the emperor will be next month, or if your town will become the next battlefield for two competing Roman armies? The civil war addiction was perhaps the most direct and brutal form of Rome's suicide. It drained the treasury, decimated the population, and left the frontiers wide open for actual external enemies to pour in. While the best legions were busy killing each other in Italy or Gaul, the Goths, the Franks, and the Sassanid Persians were raiding and pillaging with impunity. Rome was so obsessed with its internal power struggles that it forgot who the real enemy was. It was fighting a war on two fronts, but the most dangerous one was against itself. Out of the bloody chaos of the civil war addiction, a figure of immense will and ruthless pragmatism emerges. The Emperor Diocletian. He is a soldier, not an aristocrat, and he sees the empire not as a sacred inheritance but as a broken machine that needs to be brutally overhauled. His solution is one of the most radical and telling decisions in Roman history. He decides the empire is simply too large, too sick, to be governed by one man from one city. So, he divides it, first into 4 parts, in a system called the Tetrarchy, with 2 senior and 2 junior emperors. But this system eventually solidifies into a more permanent division, a split between East and West. You are witnessing the moment a body decides to amputate its own limb in the desperate hope of survival. This wasn't just an administrative reform, it was a profound psychological break. For centuries, the unifying idea of the empire was its indivisibility, the Imperium Romanum, one state, under one authority, radiating from one city. Diocletian's decision was a formal, public admission that this idea was dead. It was an open confession of failure. The Colossus was too weak to even stand on its own. The final, irreversible step in this process comes a few years later, under Constantine the Great. After winning yet another civil war and reuniting the empire under his sole rule, he makes a stunning choice. He decides to build an entirely new capital, a new Rome. He chooses a strategically brilliant location, the ancient Greek city of Byzantium, which sits at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, controlling the vital trade routes into the Black Sea. He pours unimaginable resources into its construction, creating a city he names after himself, Constantinople. The message is clear and devastating. Old Rome is no longer the center of the world. It is a relic. You can feel the center of gravity of the entire civilization shifting eastward. The West, with its decaying cities, its hollowed-out legions, and its increasingly powerful barbarian settlers, is becoming a strategic and economic backwater. The wealth, the talent, the ambition, it's all flowing to the vibrant, growing, and more easily defended East. Old Rome is left with its history, its crumbling pagan temples, and its resentful, ancient aristocracy. Constantinople is the future. It is a Christian city for a newly Christian empire, a fortress capital that can be supplied by sea, safe from the land-based barbarian hordes that threaten the West. Historians still debate the long-term consequences of this split. Was it a stroke of genius that allowed the Eastern Roman Empire, which we now call the Byzantine Empire, to survive and thrive for another 1,000 years? Or was it the act that sealed the fate of the West, draining it of the resources and manpower it desperately needed to survive? A revealing detail of this transition is how Constantine decorated his new capital. He systematically stripped the old pagan temples throughout the eastern provinces of their statues and treasures to beautify Constantinople's public squares and buildings. It was a literal transfer of cultural heritage, a clear signal that the old world was being dismantled to build the new one. The empire had been cut in two, and the western half, the original heartland, was now the weaker partner, left alone to face its many demons. It was a slow, deliberate abandonment. You find yourself in the West, in the old heartland of the empire, a guest in a magnificent country villa. The chaos of the cities and the political turmoil seem a world away. Here, life is an island of civilized luxury. You admire the intricate mosaics on the floor, depicting scenes from mythology, the beautifully painted frescoes on the walls, and the tranquil gardens with their bubbling fountains. Your host, a wealthy senator who has largely abandoned Rome for the safety of his country estate, offers you a cup of water, drawn cool and fresh from his private plumbing system. It tastes clean and pure, but as you drink, you are unknowingly participating in one of the most debated and insidious forms of Rome's slow suicide, the lead in the water. This is a famous theory, and a terrifying one. The Romans were master engineers, and their aqueducts were wonders of the world. But to bring the water from the main channels into individual homes, they used thousands of miles of lead pipes, known as fistulae. They were easy to make, easy to bend, and incredibly durable. The Romans even knew lead had its dangers. The writer Vitruvius noted that water from earthenware pipes was healthier than water from lead ones, but the convenience and prestige of having running water piped directly into your home was too great to resist. The very symbol of Roman sophistication, the private bath and the kitchen tap, was a potential source of a slow, cumulative poison. Now, historians and toxicologists still fiercely debate the actual impact of this. They argue that the hard water in many parts of the empire would have quickly created a layer of calcium carbonate inside the pipes, a mineral deposit that would have insulated the water from the lead itself. So perhaps the famous lead pipes weren't the ticking time bomb they are often made out to be. But that is not the end of the story, because the Romans found even more direct and efficient ways to poison themselves. They loved sweet flavors, and they had no sugar cane. Their main sweetener was honey, but they also discovered that if you boiled down grape juice in a lead pot, it produced a wonderfully sweet, syrupy liquid called sapa. This lead-laced grape syrup was used in everything. It sweetened wine, it was used as a preservative for fruit, and it was a key ingredient in countless recipes. It was a culinary staple, especially for the wealthy who could afford such refined tastes. In essence, the Roman elite were deliberately adding a potent neurotoxin to their food and drink simply because they liked the taste. It was a form of slow motion, suicide by sweetener. The symptoms of chronic lead poisoning, sterility, gout, kidney failure, and cognitive decline read like a diagnosis of the late Roman aristocracy itself. They were a class that was failing to reproduce, that was famously decadent and riddled with disease, and that was making increasingly poor decisions. You look at the opulent feast laid out on the table, the wine sweetened with sapa, the food cooked in lead-lined pots. The luxury that surrounds you is not just a sign of wealth, it's the murder weapon. This wasn't an attack from the outside. It was a poison they willingly served themselves, a hidden flaw in the very cup from which they drank. The poison, you realize, isn't just in the water or the wine. It's in the very attitude of your host. You look at this senator, this man whose ancestors might have commanded legions or governed Egypt, and you see not a pillar of the state, but a man who has defected from it. He speaks not of the latest news from the frontier or the debates in the Curia, but of his new batch of olive oil, the yield of his vineyards, and the cost of maintaining the high stone walls that now encircle his property. His world has shrunk from the size of an empire to the size of his own estate. This is the brain drain of the elite, the quiet, comfortable abandonment that hollowed out Rome's leadership. For centuries, the Roman social contract for the aristocracy was clear. In exchange for immense wealth and prestige, you were expected to serve. You would spend your youth in the army, your middle age in provincial administration, and your later years in the Senate, guiding the state. You were also expected to give back, a practice known as eulogitism. You would use your personal fortune to build temples, bathhouses, and aqueducts, to sponsor games, and to beautify your city. It was a system that harnessed private wealth for public good. But the man before you feels no such obligation. Rome, to him, is no longer a responsibility. It is a problem, a place of high taxes, political danger, and social decay. So he has left. He and thousands like him are retreating to these massive fortified villas, which are becoming less like country homes and more like private feudal kingdoms. You see it as he gives you a tour. This is not just a farm. It has its own blacksmiths, its own potters, its own weavers. It produces everything it needs, a self-sufficient island in a sea of chaos. And patrolling the walls, you see men who are not Roman legionaries. They are his private army, a band of loyal retainers known as butleri. These men are loyal to him, the man who pays and feeds them, not to the distant, irrelevant emperor. He is, in effect, his own warlord. This was a profound act of internal secession. The best and brightest, the most educated and capable minds of the empire were essentially opting out. They were taking their wealth, their administrative skills, and their political influence, and privatizing them. Historians still debate whether this retreat was driven by pure self-preservation in a chaotic world, or by a selfish desire to escape the crushing tax burden imposed by the central government. Either way, the result was the same. The central state was starved of the money and the talent it needed to function. The empire was being dismantled from within by its own ruling class. You understand the truly suicidal nature of this act. The elite were creating the very system that would replace Roman civilization, feudalism. They were building the medieval castle before the Roman Empire had even officially fallen. They were sawing off the branch they were sitting on, content that they had built themselves a comfortable nest on the falling piece. Your host raises his cup in a toast, not to the emperor or to the eternal city, but to his own little kingdom, safe behind its walls. A private paradise built on the ruins of public duty. You leave the deceptive tranquility of the country villa and journey back toward what remains of a functioning Roman city. The journey itself is a stark illustration of the empire's decay. The great Roman road is still there, a testament to the engineering genius of a bygone era, but it is in a state of disrepair. Potholes make the ride jarring, and you see entire sections where the paving stones have been stolen for local building projects. The constant flow of merchants, couriers, and legions has been replaced by a trickle of nervous travelers. When you finally arrive at the city gates, you are not greeted by the proud insignia of a legion. Instead, you are met by a new kind of official, the tax collector. He is a minor functionary in the massive, suffocating bureaucracy of the late Roman Empire, but he wields immense power. His job is to extract the resources needed to keep the state machine running, a machine that has become a monster that devours its own people. This is the bureaucracy that strangled itself. Diocletian's reforms, which you witnessed earlier, had stabilized the empire, but at a terrible cost. He created a vastly expanded civil service and a more complex administrative system, all of which had to be paid for. The tax system became brutally rigid and inescapable. To ensure a steady supply of grain and goods, the state locked people into their professions. A baker's son had to become a baker. A soldier's son had to join the army. A tenant farmer, a colonus, was legally tied to the land he worked, unable to leave. He was not technically a slave, but he was no longer a free man. This was the origin of medieval serfdom, invented by the Roman state itself in a desperate attempt to stop its economic heart from failing. The goal was no longer prosperity or growth. It was simply survival, a grim, grinding stasis enforced by the iron fist of the state. The taxes were relentless. There were land taxes, head taxes, taxes on goods, inheritance taxes. The collectors were notoriously corrupt, often demanding more than was officially required and pocketing the difference. You watch as a farmer argues with the official at the gate, his face a mask of despair. He is being taxed not on what he actually produced that year, but on what the state determined he should have produced. A drought or a crop failure was no excuse. The state needed its share, regardless. This system crushed innovation and punished productivity. Why would a farmer work to produce a surplus when he knew it would just be confiscated by the taxman? The incentive was to produce the bare minimum, to hide what you could, or to abandon your land altogether and flee to the city or the wilderness, becoming a bandit. Historians still debate the true economic impact of this overregulation and taxation, but the picture painted by contemporary sources is one of widespread misery and abandonment. The bureaucracy, designed to serve and manage the empire, had become its predator. It was a vast, inefficient, and parasitic entity that was slowly crushing the life out of the society it was supposed to protect. A curious and tragic detail is that many Roman citizens reportedly fled across the frontier to live among the barbarians, preferring a life of supposed savagery to the crushing, inescapable oppression of the late Roman tax system. They chose the Goths over the tax collectors. It is perhaps the most damning indictment of what the empire had become. It was a machine that had to destroy its own citizens in order to sustain itself. The ultimate act of bureaucratic suicide. You travel away from the oppressive atmosphere of the city and its tax collectors, seeking the source of the empire's original strength, the land itself. You find yourself in the Italian countryside, the ancient heartland of Rome. But the landscape you see is not the lush, fertile garden you might have read about. It is tired, worn out. Patches of the hillside are bare and eroded, scarred with deep gullies where the topsoil has washed away. The once mighty forests that covered the Apennine Mountains have been pushed back to the highest, most inaccessible peaks. This is the environmental reckoning, a quiet, slow-motion form of suicide that undermined the very ground beneath Rome's feet. The Romans were brilliant engineers, but they were not ecologists. Their relationship with the natural world was one of pure extraction. They saw a forest and saw timber for ships, fuel for heating their baths, and land to be cleared for farming. For centuries, this relentless consumption fueled their expansion and their increasingly luxurious lifestyle. The famous Roman baths, a cornerstone of their culture, consumed staggering amounts of wood to keep their vast pools and steam rooms heated. The mining operations, which produced the gold and silver that filled the treasury, used huge quantities of timber to shore up tunnels and smelt, while also polluting rivers with toxic heavy metals. This deforestation had predictable and devastating consequences. Without the tree roots to hold the soil in place, massive erosion occurred. Hillsides washed away into the rivers, silting up ports and creating malarial swamps in what were once fertile plains. The famous port of Ostia, which you saw in its state of decay, was not just a victim of economic collapse, but also of environmental change. The silt pouring down the Tiber River slowly pushed the coastline further out to sea, leaving the once bustling harbor high and dry. The city of Rome was literally choking its own lifeline. In the fields, another slow disaster was unfolding. The Romans practiced a form of agriculture that was incredibly intensive. Huge estates, the latifondia, often owned by the same aristocrats you saw hiding in their villas, were dedicated to growing single cash crops, like wheat or olives. This monoculture exhausted the soil, stripping it of essential nutrients. Overgrazing by vast herds of sheep and goats further degraded the land, turning once productive pastures into barren land. They were treating their environment like they treated their treasury, as an infinite resource to be exploited without thought for the future. Historians still debate the full extent to which this self-inflicted ecological damage contributed to the empire's fall. Some argue it was a major factor, creating food shortages and economic instability that weakened the state from the ground up. A striking piece of evidence is the analysis of ice core from Greenland, which show a dramatic spike in lead pollution in the atmosphere during the peak of the Roman Empire, a silent testament to the industrial scale of their mining and smelting operations. And then, a sudden drop as the empire collapsed. You look at the tired, wounded landscape around you. This wasn't an act of God or a natural disaster. This was the result of centuries of choices. It was a slow, deliberate poisoning of the earth that sustained them, a final, fatal mistake in the long list of ways Rome took its own life. You have seen the political decay, the economic ruin, the military hollowing, the demographic collapse, and the environmental degradation. You have witnessed all the physical symptoms of Rome's slow suicide, but now you begin to sense the underlying cause, the disease of the soul that made all the others possible. You are witnessing the loss of the Roman idea, the slow dissolution of the powerful, unifying identity that had held this vast, diverse empire together for centuries. What did it mean to be Roman? In the early days, it was simple. You were a citizen of the city of Rome. You spoke Latin, you served in the legions, and you participated in the political life of the Republic. But as the empire expanded, the idea had to expand with it. It became a broader, more inclusive concept. To be Roman was to be a part of a great, civilized project. It meant respecting the rule of law, using a common currency, participating in a shared culture, and believing in the mission of the empire to bring peace and order to the world. The Pax Romana. This idea was so powerful that for centuries, millions of people from dozens of different cultures, Gauls, Greeks, Syrians, Africans, were proud to call themselves Romans. But now, as you walk through a provincial town in late antiquity, that pride is gone. It has been replaced by a weary cynicism, or, more commonly, by a retreat into a more local identity. You listen to the conversations in the marketplace. People don't talk about being citizens of the empire. They talk about being from Antioch, or from Alexandria, or from their specific village. Their loyalty is to their local bishop, or to the wealthy aristocrat in the nearby villa, or to their own ethnic group. The grand, unifying project has lost its meaning. The emperor is a distant, abstract figure. The army is full of foreigners. The currency is worthless. The laws seem designed only to tax and oppress. So, what is there to be loyal to? The very concept of Romanitas, or Romanes, has become a hollow shell. This was a psychological collapse, a failure of the empire's central narrative. When people stopped believing they were part of something great, the empire ceased to exist as a coherent entity. It was no longer a single organism. It was just a collection of competing interests, a geographical expression held together by the fading memory of a shared past and the diminishing threat of military force. Historians still debate precisely when this psychological tipping point was reached. Was it when Christianity offered a more compelling, universal identity that transcended the old political one? Or was it when the state itself began to treat its citizens not as partners, but as subjects to be managed and exploited? A fascinating, if simple, indicator of this is the change in art and portraiture. The confident, realistic, and individualistic statues of the early empire are replaced by stiff, stylized, and almost identical figures. The emperors are no longer depicted as unique men, but as abstract symbols of power, their faces frozen in an emotionless, otherworldly gaze. It is the art of a civilization that has lost its confidence, its humanity, and its belief in itself. You realize that an empire is not just territory and armies. It's a story that people tell themselves. And when they stop believing in that story, the empire is already dead. The rest is just a matter of time. You are standing on a hill overlooking the city of Rome, the ancient capital, the city that gave its name to the world. The date is August 24th for 10 AD. Below you, a scene of restrained chaos is unfolding. The Salarian Gate has been opened, either by a traitor's hand or by starving citizens, and an army is marching into the city. But this is not a Roman army returning in triumph. These are the Visigoths, a Germanic tribe led by their king, Alaric. For the first time in 800 years, an enemy force is inside the walls of Rome. This is the event that, for centuries, has been held up as the moment Rome fell, the sacking of Rome. But from your vantage point, having seen all the slow, internal decay, you see this event for what it truly is. It is not the murder. It is the final, contemptuous kick to a body that was already dead. You watch the Visigoths move through the streets. There is plundering, yes. They are soldiers, and this is their payday. They head for the homes of the rich senators, breaking down doors and carrying out gold, silver plate, and expensive silks. But this is not the wild, indiscriminate slaughter you might have imagined. Alaric, himself a Christian, has given strict orders to spare the great basilicas of St. Peter and St. Paul, and they become sanctuaries for terrified citizens. The sacking is a relatively orderly 3-day affair, more of a large-scale robbery than a genocidal rampage. What is most shocking about the event is not the violence, but the sheer impotence of the city. Rome, the former master of the world, is utterly helpless. The real Roman emperor, Honorius, isn't even there. He is safely barricaded in the easily defended swamp city of Ravenna, hundreds of miles to the north. The Western Roman army, a shadow of its former self, is busy fighting other threats elsewhere. The city's fate is sealed, not by a great battle, but by a pathetic, anticlimactic surrender. The psychological impact across the empire is immense. Saint Jerome, writing from Bethlehem, famously wept. The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken. To the people of the time, it felt like the end of the world. But you see the deeper truth. This wasn't the cause of the fall. It was a symptom. Alaric and his Visigoths didn't want to destroy the Roman Empire. They wanted to be a part of it. For years, Alaric had been trying to negotiate a formal position for himself and his people within the imperial system. He wanted land, a title, and a regular supply of gold. He was a disgruntled former Roman general, a product of that foederati system you saw earlier. The sacking was an act of desperation, a brutal negotiating tactic by a man who felt he was being ignored and disrespected by the incompetent Roman government in Ravenna. Historians still debate the true level of destruction during the sack, with many now arguing it was far less severe than later accounts claimed. A famous, though likely apocryphal, story illustrates the pathetic detachment of the emperor. When a messenger reached Honorius in Ravenna and breathlessly announced, "Rome has perished," the emperor was reportedly distraught, thinking the messenger was talking about his favorite pet rooster, whom he had also named Rome. Whether true or not, the story perfectly captures the state of the Western Empire. Its leadership was disconnected, its defenses were a sham, and its ancient capital was a hollowed-out prize, waiting to be taken by the first person who dared to try. The sack wasn't the fatal blow. It was merely the confirmation of a death that had occurred long before. The Visigoths eventually leave, laden with treasure, and a strange quiet settles over the violated city. The final official end of the Western Roman Empire will come a few decades later, in 476 AD, when the last Western emperor, a young boy ironically named Romulus Augustulus, is deposed by the Germanic chieftain Odoacer. Odoacer doesn't even bother to proclaim himself emperor. He simply sends the imperial regalia, the purple robe and diadem, to the emperor in Constantinople, a symbolic gesture that says the West is finished. It's an end that comes not with a bang, but with a quiet packing of a box. But as you walk through the now humbled streets of Rome, you begin to question if the end is the right word. The political entity known as the Western Roman Empire is gone. But Rome itself, the idea of Rome, is far harder to kill. You see a group of priests chanting in a church that was once a pagan temple, their Latin liturgy a direct echo of the language of Cicero and Virgil. You see a local administrator trying to resolve a property dispute using principles laid out in the Theodosian Code, a great compilation of Roman law. The ghost of the empire is everywhere. This is the ghost in the machine, the powerful afterlife of a civilization that refused to stay dead. The very barbarians who overran the western provinces didn't want to destroy Roman civilization. They admired it. They wanted to inherit it. Odoacer, Theodoric the Great, Clovis the Frank. These new kings adopted Roman titles, issued coins that mimicked Roman ones, and tried to preserve the Roman administrative system. They were like the new owners of a grand, dilapidated mansion. They didn't understand all the plumbing, and they might have knocked down a few walls, but they were trying their best to live in it, not burn it to the ground. The Catholic Church, based in Rome, became the most powerful institution in post-Roman Europe, preserving Latin, literacy, and the Roman administrative structure through its dioceses, which were based on the old Roman provincial boundaries. So, Did Rome really die, or did it simply transmute into something else? You see the roads, the aqueducts, the legal principles, the language, the religion. The hardware is broken, but the software is still running. It's a profound question about the nature of a civilization. Is an empire its armies and its emperors, or is it the set of ideas and institutions it leaves behind? This is the ultimate paradox of Rome's suicide. Even in its death, it managed to set the agenda for the next 1,000 years. The dream of a unified Christian Europe, the Holy Roman Empire, was a direct attempt to resurrect the ghost of Rome. The legal systems of most Western nations are still deeply rooted in Roman law. The languages you might speak today, Spanish, French, Italian, Portuguese, Romanian, are all just modern forms of the Latin spoken by the legionaries and merchants you saw earlier. Historians still debate what we truly mean when we say Rome fell. It's a simplistic phrase for a messy, complicated, and centuries-long process of transformation. A fascinating detail is the survival of the Roman Senate. This institution, which you saw reduced to a rubber stamp, continued to meet and function in Rome for at least another century after the last emperor was deposed, a phantom limb of a body long gone. You look around at the enduring legacy, and you realize Rome's story doesn't have a clear ending. It committed suicide, but it left a ghost so powerful that we are all still living in its shadow. You stand now at the end of this long and winding journey, looking back at the colossal wreck of a civilization. It feels less like a historical study and more like an autopsy. The body of the Western Roman Empire lies on the table, and you have spent the night carefully examining every organ, every limb, every drop of blood, searching for the cause of death, and the conclusion is now unavoidable. There is no single sword thrust from a barbarian warrior to point to, no clear mark of a foreign murderer. The report would read death by suicide, a slow, methodical, and multifaceted act of self-destruction carried out over centuries. The evidence is overwhelming. Rome poisoned its own blood with debased currency, destroying the trust that fueled its commerce. It starved its political brain of oxygen, trading civic duty for the hollow spectacle of bread and circuses. Its immune system, the mighty legions, began attacking the body it was meant to protect, turning on itself in an endless fever of civil war. The leadership, in a desperate act of self-preservation, chose to amputate its own limbs, splitting the empire and abandoning the West to its fate. The very elite who should have been its stewards retreated into their private kingdoms, draining the state of talent and treasure. And all the while, the state itself became a ravenous predator, its bureaucracy strangling the populace with a web of taxes and regulations so oppressive that life among the barbarians began to look like a better option. The official time of death is often listed as 476 AD, the year the last emperor in the West was quietly pensioned off. But you know that's just the moment the doctor signed the certificate. The patient had been gone for a long time. The tragedy is that it was a suicide so slow that no single generation could see it was happening. They were merely dealing with the crisis of their day, making what seemed like pragmatic choices, unaware that each choice was another small dose of poison, another slight turn of the knife. The most powerful men in the world, the Caesars, left a name so potent that it would become the root word for absolute rulers in other lands for 1,000 years. The Kaisers and the Tsars, a final linguistic ghost of Roman power. And now, for the final, most chilling part of the autopsy. You hold up a mirror to the ancient body, and you see a faint reflection of the modern world. The symptoms on the list are unsettlingly familiar. A complex global economy, strained by debt and instability. Deep political divisions that turn citizens against each other. A search for meaning and identity in a rapidly changing culture. The long-term consequences of environmental exploitation coming due. Historians will forever argue whether this was a death or merely a metamorphosis, a fall or a transformation. But the story of Rome is more than an academic debate. It is a warning, a cautionary tale written on the largest canvas in human history. It reminds us that the most formidable walls can be breached, not by an invading army, but by the decay of the foundations upon which they are built. And it proves that the greatest threats to any great power are rarely the enemies at the gate. They are the ones that are nurtured, ignored, and allowed to fester within. The great autopsy is complete. The story is told, and the echoes of falling cities and clashing armies begin to fade, receding into the quiet dark of the past. Let the weight of history settle now, not as a burden, but as the soft pressure of a blanket, a reminder of the immense distance between that troubled world and the safety of your own quiet room. The endless political dramas, the rise and fall of emperors, the desperate struggle for survival, all of it dissolves into the gentle hum of the present moment. There are no more legions marching, no more cities burning, only the slow and steady rhythm of your own breathing, a quiet anchor in the peaceful sea of the night. The light of the moon may trace a silver line on your floor, a silent testament to the same celestial bodies that watched over the Caesars and the senators, a comforting thread of continuity that stretches across the ages. Feel the stillness around you, a profound peace that the citizens of a collapsing empire could only have dreamed of. You are safe here, in this haven you have made for yourself, far from the grand and tragic sweep of history. Allow your thoughts to drift, to soften, to let go of the intricate details, and simply float on the surface of comfort and rest. The journey is over, the lessons have been learned, and now, all that remains is the gentle descent into a deep and untroubled sleep, where the only empire that matters is the one you build in your dreams. The end. Sweet dreams.